Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti. Renaissance people, what a joy it is to welcome you back to the podcast where we are currently examining the history of the early Renaissance. This is our fourth episode that follows a loosely linear model which is tracing the philosophical, historical, and stylistic ways in which the Renaissance emerged out of the Middle Ages. With a couple of brief exceptions, we haven't actually looked at works that absolutely and firmly fall under the category of Renaissance painting. That is, until now. It is with absolute pleasure that I am introducing one of the most important masters of the early Renaissance, known simply as Masaccio. I am talking about one, Tommaso di Ser Giovanni di Simone, famously known as Masaccio. The giving of fun nicknames is a trademark of the Renaissance. Maso is just short for Tommaso, and adding the suffix accio, even in modern Italian today, it just means that something is bad. So Maso plus accio makes Masaccio, bad Tom, bad boy Tom, or what have you. In fact, Giorgio Vasari, remember that author of Lives of the Artists, as we call his long-titled text, addresses his nickname, saying that his name, quote, was not because he was a bad man, for he embodied goodness itself, but rather because of his complete lack of concern, end quote. Concern for what? I don't know. He seemed to be a bit willy-nilly, I suppose, so let's call him Willy-Nilly Tom, I guess. I don't know. Willy-nilly or not, Masaccio stands out as one of the most influential figures in the history of not only Western art, but as an absolute crucial figure in the Florentine Renaissance. Why? Remember that amazing Gothic art we talked about by artists such as Lorenzo Monaco and Gentile da Fabriano? Well, Masaccio is going to completely reject the Gothic style and fully adapt to the ideas of the rising humanistic culture around him. Masaccio's work is marked by a series of remarkable innovations that help to define the early Renaissance and set the stage for the profound artistic developments that followed. He was born in 1401 in San Giovanni Valdarno, which is near Florence, in a modest family. His father, Giovanni di Simone Casai, was a notary, but he died when Masaccio was only 5 or 6 years old. The tragedy of this story is really that Masaccio did not live a long life. He was only 26, maybe 27, when he died in the year of 1428, leaving behind a legacy of achievement, which we're going to get into. His cause of death is unknown. It wasn't the plague, or maybe it was, since it's unknown. But that seems to be the punchline to all of these early deaths. It's not for Masaccio. Little is known about his early education or his artistic training. It's believed that he was apprenticed to a painter in Florence, which would have occurred in the early years of his adolescence, though the identity of his master is not known. What is clear is that by the time he was in his early 20s, Masaccio had absorbed the innovative ideas circulating in Florence, particularly those related to the study of perspective, human anatomy, and the naturalistic depiction of the human figures. Naturalism is key here, everybody. These ideas were influenced by the works of earlier artists like, take a wild guess, who I'm about to name drop, Giotto. So he's sort of the next progression of Giotto-esque naturalism. This also includes new scientific and mathematical approaches to art being explored by his contemporaries in Florence, such as Filippo Brunelleschi, right, the sculptor and architect who designed the dome of the Duomo, Donatello, and Leon Battista Alberti. Remember, Alberti's treatise on painting was released in the 1430s, while Masaccio's work, which accurately demonstrates linear perspective, are from the 1420s, which suggest a close connection between Brunelleschi, who's experimenting with perspective techniques, and Alberti, who put it into writing, and Masaccio, who actually uses those techniques before they are published. Indeed, Vasari even claims that Brunelleschi taught those techniques of linear perspective to Masaccio. We don't know if that's true or not. So it's within this social environment that Masaccio's rise to prominency was swift. By 1422, he had already joined the Florentine Painters Guild, which is called the Arte dei Medici e Speziali, arte meaning guild. While still in his early 20s, Masaccio received significant commissions that placed him at the forefront of the artistic scene in Florence. Despite his youth, his works exhibited a mastery of perspective and realistic portrayal of human figures that are unparalleled for this time period. You have to remember that when you look at his work. It seems old. It doesn't look innovative when you think of it alongside works of the later Renaissance in the 1450s, 60s, 80s, and beyond. It is highly innovative for its moment in the 1420s. This crucial turning point in his career, though, it comes with his collaboration with an older painter by the name of Masolino. You often see Masaccio and Masolino grouped together because they worked on commissions together. So the two artists are working on several projects, but the most notable is a cycle in the Brancacci Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence. So the chapel frescoes were commissioned by Felice Brancacci, a wealthy Florentine silk merchant, politician, and an art patron, obviously. So what we're talking about is a Carmelite church, which offers special devotion to Saint Peter. And the so-called cycle was commissioned to contain stories of Saint Peter's life, as well as some scenes from the Old Testament. We're going to look at both. Although Masolino was a more established artist, it was Masaccio's contributions to the Brancacci Chapel that stood out as both stylistic and technical advancements in art, naturalism, in the production of naturalism in art. So he's showcasing his own revolutionary approach to both form and space, but also human expression. This is important. I cannot detail the entirety of the Brancacci Chapel, as some parts were actually completed by Masolino, some entirely by Masaccio, which was in the 1420s, but they left the work incomplete, and it's not fully completed until 1485 by Filippino Lippi, who is the son of Filippo Lippi and the pupil of that famous Sandro Botticelli. So I want to focus briefly on Masaccio's work in the chapel, some examples of it, not all of it, and why it's important before we get on to like the superstar of the day. So for the Brancacci Chapel, we're looking at his Expulsion from Paradise and a work known as Tribute Money, which was completed between 1425 and 1427. If we were to look at the Adam and Eves of both Masaccio and Masolino side by side, because they both paint an Adam and Eve in the Brancacci Chapel, what we see is a radical departure from convention when we compare Masolino's treatments of the same figures. So take a look if you can. I'm looking at Masolino's Temptation of Adam and Eve alongside Masaccio's Expulsion from Paradise in the Brancacci Chapel in Florence. These tell the story of original sin, where Adam and Eve are first tempted in the garden, and when they take the fruit of knowledge, God expels them from paradise. So Masolino's really working with his human bodies. We're looking at naked bodies, which is important here. Adam and Eve in paradise, before they are aware of their newness, before they are aware of human sin. In Masolino's temptation, right? They're being tempted by this serpent that has this human female head. And the bodies are really rigid. Their feet are sort of planted in a space, but they're not firmly planted. They have this sort of still, stiff, symbolic, corporeal resonance that is a hangover from Gothic tradition. Show the figures, but the figures are not meant to come to life. Okay, Masolino is not a second-rate artist. He's a master. He's modeling in light and shade with expertise. His composition is compelling. His figures are interesting. But when you look at them next to Masaccio's, who are in agonizing emotion. These deep shadows, extremely bright highlights. Look at the face of Eve, who is wailing in agony as the Archangel Michael expels them from the garden. In the way they walk, in the way Masaccio puts shadows at their feet, springing off into the back, to plant them firmly in the space that they're in. Adam is not standing stiffly with his arm out. His hands come up to his weeping face, and he is striding forward, accepting his punishment, just as Eve is. But what's going on with her? Her arm comes across her breast. Her other arm comes down to cover her genitals in shame. And what is that? To my dear, humble listeners, I'm sure this is a pose you have seen before. It is a Venus pudica pose. It is a pose that comes directly from classical sources, from antiquity. Masaccio, in his 20s, is picking up on this fad of antique revival in the humanist culture of Florence, and he is producing a painting that replicates the pose of an antique sculpture. Okay? So if you look at these side by side, you're not going to miss the ways in which Masaccio is departing from Masolino's more mature style towards something radically different that is based on emotion, naturalism, but also something rooted in classical antiquity. In the same chapel, we have Masaccio's tribute money, where we see a moment in the story of St. Peter where Christ and his apostles are demanded to pay a tax on their way to a city called Capharnaum. So, with no money in hand, Christ instructs Peter to catch a fish and to retrieve the tax from the mouth of the fish to pay this Roman tax collector. It's very interesting that in this moment in the life of St. Peter is chosen. Why? Let's construct the social ambiance here. Remember the Visconti, those aggressive dukes of Milan, John Galeazzo Visconti, who died of plague in 1402. His successors continued to wage war in northern Italy after his death. They are increasing their military threat in war that lasted, in this moment, from 1422 to 1427. Does that sound like the same range of dates in which the Brancacci Chapel is being painted? Yes, it does. So with war at hand, the Florentine Republic is going to impose property taxes, and that includes on the churches. And Pope Martin V is diligently opposed to the taxation of the churches to fight this war against Milan. And remember, we're in a Carmelite church, which is indebted to the Pope, indebted to St. Peter, who they recognize as the first Pope of the Catholic Church. So there is some political baggage at hand here. So in the end of the day, the tax situation was reduced, but that has little to do with our painting here. What that tells us is that this is the social circumstances and the importance of why this scene is being centralized in this fresco cycle. But beyond that, it's the artistic innovation that we see within it. Okay, so this is a scene from the life of St. Peter that interacts with a current moral circumstance within the Florentine Republic and its relationship to the church. That's the important part here. So what are we talking about when we look at his tribute money? We are talking about figures grounded again. This is a big, big deal. We saw in Giotto how they stopped being as stacked. We saw in Gentile how they are more grounded in space, but we still get this stacked perspective. Not here. We have a clear horizon line that cuts across the back of the lake, through the mountain, across the head of Christ. We have orthogonals that come from the building. So he's using perspective here to direct your eyes towards Christ. But we have three scenes. What's going on? Christ demanding Peter in the middle to get the fish, who's off to the left again, Peter, with his robe next to him, getting the money from the fish. That comes back to Christ, who Christ says to Peter to pay their tax. So Christ is using Peter to get his passage to continue preaching his gospel. That interacts directly with the attitudes of this church, in which Peter is the intermediary for Christ, and thus so is the Pope in this circumstance against the Florentines for their tax increase for the war against Milan. Does all of that make sense? So, the figures are grounded, recession in space, clear orthogonals of perspective, we'll talk about that more in a minute, and the emotion of the scene, which should relate to the actual living people in the moment that this was painted. Okay, so this is really important. We're seeing really strong, sharp Giottoesque chiaroscuro. We are seeing figures in mid-stride, movement, narrative, emotion, right? And, of course, all of the focus is brought directly to Christ, who's in the middle. Okay, that is my brief sort of telling of the tribute money.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show. And those are just two of the works that he completed in the Brancacci Chapel that helps you understand the way innovative techniques of pictorial convention are being deployed when no one else was really doing this. But Masaccio's single most important work, the last major work of his very short career, and the big takeaway from our discussion today is Masaccio's Holy Trinity in the Church of Santa Maria Novella in Florence. Masaccio was awarded this prestigious commission, but who exactly paid for it, we don't know, even though they are featured in the painting. We'll get to that. So this painting was completed in 1427, right before Masaccio would leave Florence for Rome, where his mysterious death would occur. This work, his Trinity is what I'll call it going forward, is really well known to students of Renaissance art, and it is often the poster child of all of the elements of how we define early Renaissance painting. This is really important for you guys to know. Let's take a look. Masaccio on the wall in fresco of Santa Maria Novella has for the first time constructed a space of a holy scene which recedes and constructs a new imaginary space. We have to look at the technical, mathematical basis for how space is constructed here. What are we looking at? Right? Masaccio's Holy Trinity. What is the Trinity? For those of us who do not know Christian doctrine, that is the three that are one, that are the divine monotheistic deity of the Christian faith, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. Where do we see this here? The crucified Christ is God the Son. Above him, and if you're not looking at a high-resolution image of this, it actually looks like God the Father, the older man behind him, has a white collar that's not a white collar at all. It's the dove of the Holy Spirit. And they, the three of them, with right below them being the Saints Mary and St. John, are within the religious space that are set inside of a Roman arch, a triumphal arch maybe, something like the Arch of Constantine or the Arch of Titus, with Roman coffering. Now, these are not Gothic pointed arches. These are directly taken from Roman architecture, classical revival, early Renaissance. It's a barrel vault, okay? So the Trinity itself is represented physically as the dove, as God, as Christ, with the saints. And outside of that barrel vault, in our space, are what are called donor portraits, the portraits of the people who paid, who are praying to the image. But we are not supposed to think they are in the image. We are supposed to understand that they are in our space, praying to the symbolic idea of the Trinity, the symbolic idea of Christ's death and salvation through worship of the Lord and I'm saying that as someone studying art, not as a religious person. They are supposed to show you what to do, but also say, look who painted these, and people in the time would recognize them. We don't know who they are. There are theories, but we don't know. Even Vasari says, the donors are shown, but I don't know who they are. So even 120 years later, he had lost sight of who the patrons were. And when you come directly below that, painted, this is part of the painting too, is a tomb with a skeleton on it. And what does the skeleton say? He has written right above him, and this is all the same fresco. But now that tomb extends into our space even closer to us. And he says, and I'm going to read it in the Italian, Io fu già quel che voi siete, e quel che io sono voi ancora sarete. Which means, I was that which you are, and I am what you will be. Meaning, look at this skeleton, I am dead, and you will be too. Memento mori, not momento. I always say momento, it's memento mori. Remember, you will die. It is telling you that Christ died and was resurrected, and if you follow him, you will die too. You'll become a skeleton too, but don't worry, you can also be resurrected. That is the message here, through the same type of worship that these donors are doing by paying for this fresco. Does that all make sense? And now here's the most important part. Now look, this is done with linear perspective. That means there is a horizon line. There is a vanishing point, which is actually at the bottom of the cross. How do you find the vanishing point? You follow the orthogonals. What are the orthogonals? The diagonal lines that come off the vanishing point. Where do you see those orthogonals? In the coffering of the barrel vault, and the diagonal lines that make up the architectural space, the columns, the capitals, they all go to the same space. And that makes you believe that this space goes into the wall, even though you know it doesn't. It looks like it does. And you can see that those are consistently, mathematically devised on the face of this painting, right? And that is this step towards naturalism. It is after this work that artists can finally begin, and Alberti's treatise on painting about 10 years later, that they can read how to construct mathematical, realistic space in their paintings, and that becomes the single most important thing for the Renaissance artists in Florence. Now, I want to be clear, something like this Trinity painting does not just show a spontaneous individual genius, but an interaction with a larger world of thinkers. So, of course, it seems likely that Filippo Brunelleschi probably was involved with the production of this. There is no absolute proof of that, but these artists knew each other. They talked to each other. They talked about each other. So when we understand that Brunelleschi was at the foreground of actually doing mathematical experiments in the realm of linear perspective, we can assume that as a prominent Florentine within this social milieu in which Masaccio was painting, there had to be some types of interactions, especially since we have Vasari mentioning that Brunelleschi was probably involved, and actually evidence that Brunelleschi spoke a eulogy about the death of Masaccio. So they knew each other, they were aware of each other, and the evidence suggests that perspective was being developed by Brunelleschi and deployed by Masaccio, and then again written down by Alberti, who, by the way, did the facade of Santa Maria Novella, this beautiful white and green marble that is on the outside of the church to this day. Looking at how radically different this work is, how technically advanced, what marvel it would have been for viewers of the 1420s who are seeing these types of artistic moves for the first time by artists in their age. It's this idea that the great artists of antiquity are gone and we don't have that anymore, and boom, suddenly you have a Masaccio, you have a Donatello, you have a Brunelleschi, who are saying not only are we mimicking what the ancients are doing, we're surpassing them. So Masaccio's passing, his death, it left the art world in mourning for a talent lost far too soon. Despite his brief life, Masaccio's influence was profound, and he was perceived to have been the artist to truly claim mastery over nature, that fixation that will follow the entire future artists of the Renaissance. Let me repeat, his pioneering use of linear perspective and naturalism in painting laid the foundations for both the progression of the early Renaissance through artists like Fra Angelico, Filippo Lippi, and the innovations of the High Renaissance like Michelangelo and Raphael. Masaccio's legacy is one of innovation and transformation. It is just a very short career, right? And in that process, he helped to shift the entire course of Western art, moving it away from the stylized forms of the Gothic era towards a more realistic and human-centered approach. Today, Masaccio is remembered not just for his individual works, but as the catalyst for the artistic revolution that would define the entire Renaissance in Italy. We need to have Masaccio in mind as we move forward in the realm of art, technique, and especially what we're going to look at moving forward with painting. Renaissance people, thank you so much for listening and for everything you do to help keep this podcast going. Please be sure to show your support by sharing our post, liking our content, and helping spread the word. That is the best way to increase the reach of a podcast, is to tell people who you think will like it to give it a listen. Please leave us a review. That helps us a lot, and I look forward to speaking with you next time. Arrivederci.